Welcome to Forbes Newsroom. Joining me now is Senator Tammy Duckworth. Senator, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Of course, you introduced legislation earlier this month that calls on the Federal Aviation Administration to be more transparent about its emergency evacuation standards. Can you explain why you saw the need for your bill?
Yes, well, the FAA conducted an evacuation test to see if they could evacuate an aircraft to the standard that they have, which is 90 seconds. And then when I looked at how they conducted the test, they only had 60 passengers on the aircraft, and nobody had carry-on luggage, and all the passengers were adults and under the age of 60. And I don't know when the last time you were on an airplane that only had 60 people on it and nobody brought carry-on luggage. But I thought that's not a realistic test, and it could endanger the flying public if we're training to a standard that's not realistic.
And is this 90-second benchmark feasible at all?
Well, that's the thing. I don't know. The FAA thought it was feasible back when it put it into place as part of FAA regulation, but that was a number of years ago, maybe even more than a decade ago. I don't, but it's been around for a very long time, and they're still testing aircraft configurations to that old standard. And my response is great. I mean, if that's your regulation and that's the standard, then let's test to that. But let's conduct a realistic test, and recreate real world conditions, not this artificial situation where you only put 60 people on an airplane.
Of course, and I want you to explain your legislation. How would your bill fix this?
So my bill would require the FAA, when they conduct these tests, to include certain things. They have to include passengers of different ages. They have to include passengers with disabilities. Passengers have to be different heights and weights. They have to include carry-on baggage. So they have to simulate that people were actually bring carry-on luggage onto an airplane. They have to include passengers or simulate passengers who can't speak English or who are nonverbal. And then they have to take into account the seat size and the pitch of seats in modern aircraft. And the whole goal being that if we're going to train flight attendants and cabin crews to evacuate to a 90-second standards, then we need to make sure that that's actually something that's achievable. And if it's not achievable, then we need to know that, because the firefighters on the ground need to know how quickly they have to get to an airplane and how long it's going to take to evacuate that airplane. And right now we have no real world benchmark by which to measure that.
I do want to take a step back here. What has changed since the 1960s when the FAA first began requiring planes to be evacuated in 90 seconds or less?
Well, let's see. The seats have gotten smaller. There are more seats. They're more closely packed inside an aircraft. The pitch is much straighter, so it's harder to get in and out. I don't know when the last time you got in and out of an airplane. I fly at least once a week. And you can see how tightly passengers are packed into aircraft. People are carrying more on board. Ever since airlines started charging for you to check in luggage, more people carry more bags on board the aircraft. So there's more stuff getting in the way. Parents like myself who have young children are now using car seats in airplanes. And so our children are strapped into car seats on airplanes for their safety if there is some sort of a forced landing. But that means you've got to deal with car seats when you're trying to evacuate the aircraft and unstrapped children. None of that was standard practice in the 1960s.
Who do you think is to blame here for these evacuation standards missing the mark?
I just think it's not been updated. And I think that the FAA is training to an old standard and not taking into account modern aircraft configurations. And so I felt that it was important to make sure that they do take into account all of the variables that exist in modern day travel. Too often in the aviation industry, I'm a pilot. I flew for the Army and I fly in civilian as a general aviation pilot as well. The saying is that FAA regulations are written in blood. And that is the FAA changes its rules after there's a terrible accident and somebody gets injured or dies. And I don't want that to happen before we change the standards for this. I'd rather fix the problem now so that we can properly train our cabin crews and our firefighting and our rescue personnel so that we don't have to write this regulation in blood.
Why do you think the FAA is so hesitant to change their standards in general?
Well, it's a bureaucratic process, and you're going to have to ask the FAA, but too often it's a reactive agency as opposed to being a proactive agency. And I just want to make sure that in this case we don't put passengers in harm's way by certifying an aircraft or certifying an evacuation time, so like 90 seconds. That is not realistic.
Senator Duckworth, you introduced this bill with fellow Democrat Senator Tammy Baldwin. There has been a slew of bipartisan legislation under President Biden, like the PACT Act, the Chips and Science Act, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and even your Protecting Moms Who Served Act, just to name a few. Does this legislation have bipartisan support?
It does, and we're working to get co-sponsors on it. We just wanted to make sure we introduced it as quickly as possible because the FAA is conducting these tests, and we wanted to send a message to the FAA that this was in the works. And I will work to get Republican co-sponsors on the bill.
And what overall has been the response to your legislation?
Well, there's been two main groups. The aircraft manufacturers are opposed to it, and we've gotten some criticism saying that, well, it's not ethically responsible to put people with disabilities on an aircraft to conduct an evacuation test because you may harm them. It's not ethical to put infants into aircraft as you're conducting these tests because the infants could be harmed. And my response to those folks is, we do this all the time when we test the safety of a car seat. It's not ethical to put an infant into a car seat and crash a car at 35 miles an hour towards a brick wall to see whether or not the car seat is safe. But we use crash test dummies for this purpose. We use human analog, we do all sorts of ways to test. And all I'm saying is do that. Put crash test dummies in aircraft. Simulate somebody having a broken leg and needing crutches, or somebody like me who uses a wheelchair needing to be evacuated. And you can do that without actually putting a person with a disability or an infant onto the aircraft. You can simulate it. Do that. That will serve the flying public. And then the other bigger group of people are people who really truly support the bill. I've gotten endorsements from aviation groups, flight attendants groups, as well as from groups like the AARP, the Paralyzed Veterans of America. Captain Sully Sullenberger, the Miracle on the Hudson pilot, has endorsed my legislation. Now, he's a guy who knows about having to evacuate an aircraft quickly under very extreme circumstances, and he thinks this is a good bill.
And I think it took him 3 minutes to evacuate his plane total. So that doesn't meet that 90-second benchmark. So that's a great voice of support there.
Yes, it is. And it is really a wide range of support for this bill. It's not just aviation industry insiders like flight attendants and ground crews and the like, but it is a wide variety of folks who are interested in the well-being of the general public, like the AARP, like veterans groups.
Has the FAA responded?
No, not yet, but we will continue to push them to update their regulation and their standards, even without us having to pass this bill.
Mark Baer, CEO of Aviation Manuals, told Forbes that Congress has been, quote, notoriously poor at funding the FAA at an adequate level. I want your response to that.
Well, I would agree with that. I think FAA needs to have better funding so that they can have all of the inspections that they need to do the inspections, that we certainly need to provide FAA with the resources to do the job that they need to do. And we're looking in this year's budget to make sure we fund them appropriately. On the other hand, there has been criticism of the FAA, for example, with the Boeing MAX 8, where they've gotten a little bit too cozy with industry. And too often they have deferred to aircraft manufacturers and to commercial aviation folks in influencing their decision making, and that's really not the role of the FAA. The role of the FAA is to be an independent organization that ensures the safety of flying for the American people.
Senator Duckworth, we will continue to keep our eye on your legislation. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.